Hello and welcome everybody. I'm here in my capacity as the chair of the Communications Committee of the Psychonomic Society to welcome you to another colloquium for the One World series. I'm also welcoming my colleague Beatrice Kuhlmann from the University of Mannheim, who will be doing the Q&A at the end of the talk. And the University of Mannheim, of course, was the institution that set up the series about 2 years ago during the beginning of the pandemic. And so they continue to assist us, and we continue to be grateful for that. And now let me introduce our speaker for tonight, Anna-Lena Schubert. Just to give you a little bit of background, Anna-Lena got her PhD in psychology at Heidelberg University in Germany in 2016. She was then still at Heidelberg on a postdoc while also visiting Joachim van der Kerkhove at UC Irvine during part of that postdoc. And she has taken up a chair in the analysis and modeling of complex data at the University of Mainz last year. And last year, she was also awarded the Higher Prize for Research on the Biological Basis of Intelligence by the International Society for Intelligence. And today, she's going to talk to us about why a higher speed of information processing facilitates reasoning. Anna-Lena, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Steve, for the very kind words, and I'm really excited that I will be speaking here today. I will briefly share my screen and would appreciate a thumbs up if everything looks good to you. Perfect, thank you. So today I will be speaking about the relationship between processing speed and reasoning ability, which is something I've been interested in for like forever, and which I think is a really interesting question because it bridges so many areas of psychology, cognitive psychology, but also individual difference research, psychometrics, and biological psychology. So let me start by speaking about reasoning ability. We know that reasoning ability predicts a large number of important life outcomes. There are a number of education-related outcomes that are related to reasoning ability, such as educational success, job success, also the development of expertise. But there are also more distant life outcomes predicted by individual differences in reasoning ability, such as health, longevity, or even psychological well-being. So quite obviously, reasoning ability is an important predictor of all those life outcomes. But although we know a lot about what we can predict using reasoning ability, we know much less about the elementary cognitive processes that give rise to individual differences in reasoning ability. And that's something I'm really interested in. There are 3 different kinds of processes that are typically discussed to underlie reasoning ability. Those are processing speed, attentional control, and working memory capacity. And in my talk, I will touch upon all 3 of those, but I will start by talking about processing speed and its really interesting relationship to reasoning abilities. So when I talk about processing speed, what do I mean with that? With processing speed, I mean reaction times in very simple decision tasks. You can also measure processing speed in, for example, clerical speed tests, but those are less strongly related to reasoning abilities than simple reaction times in decision tasks. There are now a number, two meta-analyses and a narrative review who've all sort of come to the conclusion that there's about a 0.30 correlation between reaction times and reasoning abilities. And I think this is really interesting because processing speed is such a bottom-up elementary process. And I've been wondering why that relates to reasoning ability since I started my PhD. And as you know, there are many cognitive processes that affect reaction times as a very aggregate measure. So reaction times are affected by the speed of encoding, by the speed of decision-making, and by the speed of motor execution. And hence, we do not really know which of those processes are faster in people who have higher reasoning abilities. And this is something that has been interestingly quite a lot, if people with higher reasoning ability show greater speed because of advantages in all of those processes contributing to overt response time behavior, or only in some very specific processes. If they showed a higher speed across all sorts of cognitive processes, that would imply that some property or properties, such as the degree of myelination, the speed of neural oscillation, or perhaps certain network properties, affect different cognitive processes and give rise to the association between mental speed and mental abilities. On the other hand, if people with higher reasoning ability showed a higher speed in very specific cognitive processes, then that would imply that properties of those very specific processes, and of course the underlying brain organization, would give rise to the association between mental speed and mental abilities. So how can we address this question? When we measure processing speed, we're typically using reaction times, and we're using the mean of the reaction time distribution. However, this isn't really ideal because there's much more information contained in the whole reaction time distribution than just the mean. In cognitive abilities research in particular, there's a phenomenon that's called the so-called worst performance rule. So if you take the whole reaction time distribution and put it into different quantiles, let's say into the slowest, the middle, and the fastest quantile, then you actually see that the mean reaction time isn't as strongly related to different measures of cognitive abilities as the slowest reaction times are. So if we only use mean reaction times, we're actually discarding the part of the variance that's most relevant for individual differences in reasoning abilities. There's also the issue that people have different speed accuracy trade-offs. So someone gives a faster response. We don't know if that was because they processed information more quickly or if they had a more liberal decision criterion. And that's actually a very robust finding that people with higher reasoning abilities have a more liberal decision criterion. So that's really an issue because it's confounded in the same measure. And finally, we have an issue of factor differentiation. That's an issue for everyone who's interested in psychometrics. So for example, if you design a large number of reaction time tasks supposed to measure certain cognitive domains, and then you take the mean reaction time and do a factor analysis, all you find is just this one happy G factor. And that's sort of unnerving because you were hoping to find your domain-specific structure. And together, those three issues contribute to the fact that using mean reaction times isn't really helpful in understanding individual differences in reasoning abilities. And for this reason, I've been proposing to use a neurocognitive psychometrics account, which uses mathematical models of cognition and integrates them with neurocorrelates of cognitive processes. This term builds upon the cognitive psychometrics phrase coined by Bill Batchelder, who proposed to use cognitive models in individual differences research. And I think it would be really interesting to also add the neuroscientific perspective, because both approaches allow us to sort of get a closer look of what may be underlying certain cognitive processes. In my research, I've been using the diffusion model as a model of binary decision-making to describe the latent processes contributing to reaction times and reaction time distribution. I'm pretty sure that a lot of you know the diffusion model, but I will briefly walk those of you who don't through the model. What the model does is that it takes the whole reaction time distribution of correct and incorrect responses to all the information we have when participants complete an experimental task, and it estimates a number of parameters that describe the decision process. Basically, it assumes that when you make a binary decision, you start at a certain starting point here, and then you accumulate evidence in a random walk decision process until you hit one of two decision thresholds. And the model in its most basic version distinguishes between four different parameters. The first parameter is the drift rate, and this parameter describes the strength and direction of the evidence accumulation process. So if people have a higher drift rate, they respond more quickly and also more accurately. The second parameter is the threshold separation parameter. If you have a higher threshold separation, this means that more evidence needs to be accumulated before you make your decision. So people with a higher threshold separation collect more information and therefore tend to respond more slowly, but also more accurately because they collect more information. Then we have a starting point, which we can shuffle around to model biases in decision making, but I'm not going to talk about that today. And then we have a fourth parameter, the non-decision time, which consists of the time for all non-decisional processes, such as the encoding time and motor execution time. And so the diffusion model uses the whole reaction time distribution and decomposes it into 4 latent parameters that we can then relate to individual differences in reasoning ability and study if people show advantages in all of those parameters or only in very specific ones. And we can do a very similar thing using the event-related potential. The event-related potential is generated if you record participants' EEG data while they complete an experimental task, and then you average the EEG activity across all trials. The resulting event-related potential, or ERP, consists of those funny waveforms, and it contains certain components that are defined by their topography, their polarity, and also their latency. And most importantly, those components are associated with certain cognitive processes. So we have some components occurring early in the stream of processing, such as the P1 and the M1, who are associated with early sensory processes and also early top-down control processes, such as alerting, orienting, and discrimination. And then you have some components occurring later in the stream of processing that are associated with certain higher order cognitive processes, such as cognitive control or stimulus evaluation and memory updating. And so you can take a look at those components and you can measure when they reach their peak. You can determine the peak latency as a measure of neural processing speed of the sort of cognitive process related to that component. And then again, we can study if people with higher reasoning ability show a general advantage in all of those components or only in very specific ones. However, before we can do that, we have to think about how those measures are generated, and mathematical models and also neural correlates are not typically used in individual differences research, but rather in experimental psychology, which is already something that has been highlighted by Kromer, that there is a distinction between the two disciplines. So before using those measures in individual differences research, we actually have to make sure that they reflect person properties. As psychometricians, we talk about person properties when we talk about measures that are stable across time and also across different kinds of situations. So imagine you had a measure that changed across a period of, let's say, 4 weeks and was also very task specific. This wouldn't be a good measure, not as a person property, because you wouldn't be able to measure stable trait-like individual differences. And this is a property we can try to quantify using latent state trait theory. Latent state trait theory is an extension of classical test theory that allows you to quantify the stability and consistency of certain measures or variables. And so this is something we set out to do because before using those measures in individual differences research, we wanted to make sure that we do not get null results just because our measures are inconsistent or unstable or unreliable. We estimated latent state trait models for diffusion model parameters based on a sample of about 130 participants who came into the lab twice at 8 months apart, and they completed 3 reaction time tasks with different conditions. The model you see here is the one for the drift rates, but we also estimated model for non-decision times and threshold separation parameters. And we found across all models and all parameters that they were really stable across a period of 8 months. So there's really no reason to measure twice. However, all parameters were really task dependent, and especially so for the non-decision time and the threshold separation parameter. They were quite task dependent, and also the drift rates, although not as strongly. So that means if you want to use those measures in individual difference research and you want to make sure that they do not simply reflect specific properties of a task, but rather of a person, you have to really estimate them across a number of different tasks and generate some kind of aggregate measure. A latent measure, a hierarchical measure, or even a plain mean is better than just using them in a single task. We did the same for the ERP latencies. The model looks kind of scary here because it's just more complicated, but the results were actually quite consistent. We found that all ERP latencies showed a very high temporal stability across the period of 8 months. Again, meaning that you don't have to get participants into the lab twice, which is good. But ERP latencies were even more task dependent and also just plain unreliable than diffusion model parameters. So latencies of those earlier components of the P1 and the N1 were very task dependent and unreliable, whereas things look sort of better for those ERP latencies of components occurring later in the stream of processing. So the P2, N2, and P3. But still, you still have to measure them across a large number of tasks to get reliable and consistent precision measures. And I think this kind of psychometric groundwork is really important, although perhaps not too exciting, to make sure that you have valid and reliable parameter estimates to then relate to reasoning abilities. But now, having done enough of that psychometric groundwork, we can come back to our substantial question of interest, which is whether people with higher reasoning abilities show a greater mental speed because of advantages in all sorts of cognitive processes or only in some specific processes. And I would like to walk you through 2 studies we did to address that question. The first study is one that I did together with my colleagues Veronika Lerche and Mischa von Krause from Heidelberg University. We collected a sample of 125 participants from different educational backgrounds, and they completed 6 verbal, 6 numerical, and 6 figural reaction time tasks, of which 3 were easy and 3 more complex each. When we then calculated mean reaction times for all of those tasks and ran a factor analysis, we again only found one happy big G factor, which was really dissatisfying because we hoped to find this domain-specific structure. So what happened when we used the diffusion model instead? When we used the drift rate as a measure of the speed of information uptake. When we used drift rates instead, we found very nice domain-specific factors for the verbal and the numerical domain, in addition to a general drift rate factor and a drift rate factor for complex tasks. And in this study, participants also completed a cognitive ability measure, the Berlin Intelligence Structure Test, and this is an intelligence test that contains the same domain-specific structure that we also used in our reaction time tasks. And we found very nice domain-specific correlations for the verbal and the numerical domain. And we also found substantial correlations between the general drift rate factor and the drift rate factor for more complex tasks with the general reasoning ability factor. We were able to explain 65% of participants' general reasoning ability. And this is quite a lot compared to the 0.30 correlation typically found for reaction time tasks. And our study wasn't the first to show this. A lot of people have been working with diffusion modeling in individual differences research. And I think Florian Schmiedek was the first to show this. And then there are also studies by Roger Radcliffe and by Florian Schmitz and Oliver Wilhelm. And they all showed that it's consistently the drift rate parameter of the diffusion model that is related to participants' cognitive abilities and not the other parameters, or at least not as consistently. So this really shows that people with higher reasoning abilities seem to have a very specific speed advantage in the speed of information uptake, but no speed advantage in the speed of encoding or motor responding, which I think is really interesting. The second study used the ERP latencies to address the same question. And just as a very general reminder, we can use the latencies of those components. We have components that occur earlier in the stream of processing, and then we have others that occur later in the stream of processing. And the study we conducted with a sample of 122 participants, again, from different educational backgrounds. And what we found was that those participants with higher reasoning ability showed very specific advantages during those later stages of information processing. So individual differences in the latencies of ERP components associated with higher order cognitive processes explained about 80% of the variance in reasoning abilities, whereas ERP latencies occurring during those earlier stages were only weakly related to participants' reasoning ability. And this is really exciting because it's a huge effect. 80% is quite a lot. But it's also quite concerning because I don't know how you feel about it, but I have gotten slightly skeptical about those very large effects. So we set out to do a replication of that to make sure that this was actually a thing and not just a fluke in our data. And we recently replicated the study using an independent sample of about 150 participants. And we were actually able to replicate that effect. So in our independent sample, we still found a minus 0.78 correlation between the latencies of those later components and participants' reasoning ability. We also set out to do a multiverse analysis to check how robust this relationship was. Because in EEG research, you can really see that certain settings in pre-processing and data analysis can affect your results. So we varied those factors. We varied the low-pass filter we used, ranging from 8/16 to 32 Hertz. And we also used two different measures of latency estimation. So previously, we only used the measure of peak latency estimation. And now we also use the measure of 50% fractional area latency to just check how robust our findings were if we use different measures of pre-processing. And as you can see here, regardless of which kind of low-pass filter we used and regardless of which kind of latency estimation procedure we used, we always found a rather large negative correlation ranging from minus 0.50 to minus 0.78. So this is really, really good, suggesting that we actually have a robust finding that generalizes across different samples and also across different pre-processing strategies. So I tried to give you a brief summary of what I found out about the relationship between processing speed and reasoning abilities. I showed you that we can decompose processing speed into the speed of specific components using mathematical models on the one hand and ERP latencies on the other hand. I also showed you that people with higher reasoning ability show very specific advantages in the speed of higher order cognitive processes. And I showed you that processing speed is quite strongly related to reasoning abilities if measured across different tasks. And it can explain between 25 to 80% of variance in reasoning abilities. So this is really great and exciting. And I'm sure that there are a lot of among you who also think this is really exciting, but I guess there are also some among you who are thinking about those other cognitive processes that may also be related to reasoning ability that I talked about in the very beginning. And I'm sure you're aware that working memory capacity also explains a lot of variance in reasoning abilities. There are two meta-analyses by Mike Kane and Klaus Oberauer, who reported correlations between 0.71 and 0.85 between working memory capacity and reasoning abilities. And there was one large-scale study by Gutenberg in 2014 with a sample of 2,200 participants who also reported a correlation of 0.77. So now we have both processing speed on the one hand and working memory capacity on the other hand, explaining more than 50% of variance in reasoning abilities. And because there cannot be anything more than 100% of variance, it's very sensible to assume that processing speed and working memory capacity in some way interact or jointly contribute to those individual differences in reasoning ability. So what we tried to do was to come up with a sort of framework to explain why both processing speed and working memory capacity are related to reasoning ability. And our idea was that we developed, that Gidon Frischkorn also did his PhD project on, was that measures of neural processing speed might have a positive influence on certain attentional control mechanisms in working memory, such as inhibition and updating, that would positively influence working memory capacity, but that would also show a positive effect on reasoning ability. So our idea was to measure a neural processing speed, working memory capacity, and reasoning ability, and check if the association could be mediated by individual differences in those measures of attentional control. However, to test this model, we had to measure individual differences in attentional control. And when we set out to do this in, I think, 2016, 17, we were really optimistic we could do that. But now we actually know, and I'm sure most of you are aware about this, that measuring individual differences in attentional control is actually really hard. How do we typically measure individual differences in attentional control? Well, we have an experimental tasks that consists of a simple condition and a more complex condition. This example here is of the flanked task, but other tasks work usually in the same way. So here in the simple condition, participants have to decide if a centrally presented arrow points to the left or to the right. And this arrow is flanked by non-informative stimuli. So it's really easy to do this. However, in the more complex condition, we have another process inserted into the task, and participants now have to inhibit the surrounding flankers, or they have to focus on the central flanking stimulus. And what we typically see is that reaction times increase and accuracy rates decrease from the simple to the more complex condition. And the general idea of measuring inter-individual differences in executive functions is now to measure inter-individual differences in those experimental effects. But this is not really working well for two reasons. The first reason is that difference scores are very unreliable. And this is actually something you can show quickly just using plain mathematics, because we assume that a variable we're measuring, for example, a reaction time, consists of a certain true score and some unsystematic measurement error. So if we now calculate the difference score between those two variables, let's say reaction time in a simple and reaction time in a complex condition, we subtract the two true scores and we also subtract the two unsystematic measurement errors. However, because those two true scores are highly correlated, the resulting difference score variable contains largely unsystematic measurement error, just making it very, very unreliable. And the second error pertains to a similar issue, which is sampling noise, and has been highlighted by Jeff Rauder and Julia Haaf, who showed that there's a lot of trial-to-trial variability between trials of an experimental task, much more than there is between participant variability. So those are really two issues that make measuring individual differences in attentional control quite hard. And I will show you one of our studies we did to trying to address those issues that really demonstrate how hard it is to measure those constructs. In this task, my PhD student Christoph Löffler collected data from 150 participants who completed 3 different tasks per each executive function domain. So they completed 3 inhibition, 3 updating, and 3 shifting tasks. And we started by building the measurement model suggested by Friedman and Miyake, showing the unity and diversity of executive functions. And we were actually able to replicate this model quite well, showing kind of perfect model fit. But it really has 2 issues that I think make this model very problematic. And the first issue here is that in some domains, namely inhibition and shifting, are measured using reaction times, whereas updating is measured using accuracy rates. And those are just different measures. However, this is an issue we can quite easily address by, again, using the diffusion model, because rift rates combine information contained in the reaction time distribution, but also consider accuracy rates. So what we did was that we estimated diffusion model parameters and used the drift rate instead of reaction times and accuracy rates to describe those processes. And what happens is that from unity and diversity, we start moving towards unity. So we see much stronger correlations between the 3 domains of executive functioning once we use the same measure. Another issue in the original model was that Friedman and Miyake only used difference scores for the shifting factor, whereas the inhibition and the updating task were modeled in a way that they simply took reaction times or accuracy rates in the more complex conditions. So for the inhibition, we have all those reaction times in incongruent conditions here. And for the updating task, we have typically the condition with higher updating demands. And only for shifting did they actually use different scores, perhaps because they stumbled upon the same problems of low reliabilities. I honestly don't know. But using different scores is a problem because then all your measures are really just unreliable. However, you want to find a way to control for this baseline processing efficiency to extract the variance that is specific to executive functions. And our idea in the study was to not use performance in the simple condition of all of those tasks as a baseline measure, but rather to measure baseline processing efficiency in a set of unrelated tasks to ensure that they weren't artificially highly correlated. So we estimated drift rates in our model in 3 different kinds of very simple decision tasks that we had used before, and used a partial regression model to control for this baseline processing efficiency. And as you can see here, once we do that, not much remains of the general executive functions factor. It just poof, disappears into the air. The only thing that remains is some variance that is specific to shifting, which is something that's consistent with other authors' work who've been working on the measurement of attentional control, that shifting seems to be the only executive function factor you can still somewhat reliably measure when taking into account this baseline processing efficiency. So when we then introduced reasoning ability and working memory capacity in the model, it wasn't really surprising that only the general processing efficiency was related to reasoning ability and working memory capacity, whereas we found no associations between our measures of executive functions and those higher order cognitive variables. And this is really concerning because it shows that we cannot really measure individual differences in executive functions. And we're not the only ones who've been working on that. A bunch of other people have, showing that there are sort of 3 problems. The first is that measures of executive functions have very low reliabilities, that they show low convergent validities, even within the same kind of attentional kind of executive function. Different tasks tend to correlate quite low, and they also have very low predictive validity, which means they are not related to measures of working memory capacity or reasoning ability. And people have been proposing a number of solutions to address this problem. So Jeff Rauder and Julia Haaf have been proposing to use hierarchical models to account for the sampling noise. However, even doing that, they were not able to find much compelling evidence for convergent validity across different kinds of inhibition tasks. Alodi Remerme and colleagues have been suggesting to use individually calibrated response deadlines, which again didn't really solve those issues. Chris Graham and colleagues developed a set of new experimental tasks that didn't rely on difference scores. However, while not suffering from low reliabilities, it's not yet really clear what those tasks actually measure. That is, whether they measure attentional control or a more general processing efficiency, raising questions of validity. And finally, we've been proposing to also use a neurocognitive psychometrics account to describe individual differences in attentional control, that is, using mathematical models and neurocorrelates, with which we have successfully addressed the issues of low reliabilities and low predictive validities, but we couldn't yet demonstrate their convergent validity because we have only applied those approaches to specific tasks because, for example, the mathematical models were specific to the flanker task and couldn't be easily applied to all sorts of different attentional control tasks. So to wrap this up, to make a long story short, it's really hard to measure individual differences in executive functions. And now coming back to our framework that we came up with, I have to say we haven't really been able to test this because we couldn't measure individual differences in those processes. So I will try to give you another interim summary here. We know that both working memory capacity and processing speed explain more than 50% of variance in reasoning abilities. However, we don't really know if this is due to the fact that both reasoning ability and working memory capacity rely on attentional control processes that may benefit from a higher processing speed, because we currently cannot measure individual differences in attentional control in any kind of reliable manner. And for this reason, we haven't been able to test our theoretical model yet. So we sort of went back to the drawing board, and for now we decided to disregard working memory capacity, and we will be coming back to that in a moment. So we try to think about our findings, and based on the very consistent findings relating to processing speed, we came up with a simpler process cascade model, where we assumed that a higher speed of neural processing might facilitate a higher speed of evidence accumulation, which may contribute to reasoning ability. And I'm going to show you two studies that we did to test this model and to see if this very simple process cascade model held. The first study we did was a reanalysis of existing data sets, where we translated this graphical modeling framework into a statistical model using a hierarchical Bayesian model. This is a project I did in collaboration with Joachim van der Kerkhofe and Michael Nunes when I was at UC Irvine. And we developed this hierarchical Bayesian framework to test if the relationship between ERP latencies and reasoning abilities could be accounted for by drift rates. And I would like you to focus on the central mediation model that you see here highlighted in blue. And we statistically tested if we had a significant mediation effect going on here. And what we found that we had indeed a mediation. So drift rates mediated part of the relationship between ERP latencies and intelligence here. But as you can see from this very, very tiny indirect effect, it was a very small mediation. And actually only 1% of the relationship between ERP latencies and reasoning abilities could be accounted for by individual differences in drift rates. So all in all, those results really spoke against our process model, not for it. We conducted a second, perhaps more straightforward study where we tried to experimentally manipulate processing speed. We tried to do that using nicotine patches because previous research has shown that nicotine administration enhances people's processing speed. And for this purpose, we invited 40 people into the lab twice, 1 week apart. And in at each of the 2 measurement occasions, they came in the morning at 9 a.m., took an IQ test and completed a reaction time task. Then they either got their nicotine or their placebo patch. This was done in a double-blind counterbalance design. And they came back 8 hours later because our nicotine patches reached their blood maximum level after 8 hours. And then again, completed an intelligence test and a reaction time task while we recorded their EEGs. And it turned out that we were actually quite successful in increasing participants' processing speed, both on a behavioral and also on a neural level. And on both levels, participants who got the nicotine patch or in the nicotine condition showed a decrease in their reaction times and their P3 latencies in comparison to participants in the placebo condition. So this is really nice. But what happened with their intelligence test scores? Well, we weren't really able to increase their intelligence test performance at all. We had a very robust null effect, I think the most robust null effect I've ever seen in my life, and a base factor of 13 indicating that nicotine administration did not lead to any increase in intelligence test scores in comparison to the placebo condition. So this was really disappointing because we had this really nice process cascade model, which made so much sense and it really didn't work out. But then on the other hand, it was also good to see that this is how scientific progress really works and that you get to refine your models and, well, then test them again and refine them again. And then we started thinking what else could be contributing to the relationship between processing speed and reasoning abilities. And given that we could enhance processing speed without affecting reasoning abilities, we came up with the idea that there might be a third variable that actually affects processing speed and thus affects reasoning ability. And when discussing possible variables, we quickly started to think about certain brain properties. So which brain properties might underlie the association between processing speed and reasoning abilities? One candidate is white matter tract integrity. Measures of white matter tract integrity quite generally reflect a large range of tissue characteristics. For example, the degree of myelination, the axon diameter, fiber density, fiber organization, that together determine the speed and accuracy of information transmission across the nerve fiber. And you can imagine, just like with a cable, if you have a better insulated axon, so for example, with a denser myelin layer, and if you simply have a larger diameter, that means that information can be transmitted faster. And moreover, both a higher cable and a higher axon density allow more information to be transmitted in a specific amount of time. And these two factors together positively affect processing speed and functional connectivity within and between brain regions. And there have been a couple of studies showing that measures of white matter tract integrity affect the speed of information processing, working memory capacity, and also reasoning ability. And there's even one very promising developmental study showing that white matter tract integrity promotes developmental changes in functional connectivity and reasoning ability during childhood and adolescence. Another possible candidate are measures of functional connectivity and certain brain network properties that we can record while participants are working on certain tasks. So for example, Kirsten Hilger and colleagues showed that greater nodal efficiency in the salience network, which is also associated or thought to contribute to the elicitation of the P3 component in the EEG, is also related to individual differences in reasoning abilities. Based on those findings, we assumed that the effects of structural connectivity and functional connectivity on people's reasoning ability might be fully mediated by individual differences in processing speed, really suggesting that a greater connectivity enhances both the speed and capacity of information processing, which then jointly contribute to reasoning ability. And as I said, there's longitudinal research on children and adolescents that even supports a developmental cascade model in which individual differences in white matter tract integrity drive changes in processing speed, which in turn drive changes in working memory capacity, and which then very ultimately determine the development of reasoning ability. And in our own lab, we were able to at least test part of this model, which is this part here. So we were able to look at measures of brain network structure and functional connectivity to see what they contributed to the relationship between processing speed and reasoning ability. To test this part of the model, we used a measure of frontal global theta connectivity that we calculated in a sample of 100 participants who performed a cognitive control task. We used a global connectivity measure of theta connectivity because global theta connectivity is known to reflect efficient long distance transfer between memory systems. And coming back to our thoughts about working memory, we know that working memory is related to reasoning ability. As a measure of global connectivity, we use the connectivity degree, which is a very simple graph theoretic measure. A high connectivity degree, you see an example here on the left, indicates that an electrode that you're looking at, and we just looked at frontal electrodes, has very many connections above a certain threshold. In comparison, a low connectivity degree would indicate that an electrode has only a very limited number of connections above a certain threshold. And as such, it's a really simple graph theoretic measure of long-range connectivity. What is nice about that is that we did this with EEG recordings, meaning that we had a very high temporal resolution, allowing us to check how this measure of global theta connectivity changed during the time course of an experimental task. And we conducted a median split based on participants' cognitive ability. And you see that participants with lower cognitive ability, here shown in dotted light blue, only showed a very small modulation of their connectivity degree during the task, while people with higher cognitive abilities showed first a dip in connectivity degrees and then an increase in connectivity degree. To quantify this, we estimated as many structural equation models as we had sampling points. So for each millisecond of the task, we estimated one structural equation model to estimate a latent correlation between connectivity degree and participants' cognitive abilities. Those latent correlations are shown on the y-axis here. And as you can see, we saw a substantial correlation between participants' connectivity degree and their cognitive abilities in a time window from about 300 to 700 milliseconds after stimulus onset. We then calculated the average connectivity degree during that time window centered on the P3 component of the ERP. And we found that functional connectivity during this time window was quite strongly related to participants' reasoning ability. We found a latent correlation of 0.82, which is again quite large, accounting for the fact that this is only EG data from a single task. And it really suggests that people with higher reasoning abilities benefit from an adaptive modulation of those brain networks related to certain control and memory processes. We also checked if this association was specific to this later time window and specific to the frontal electrodes, because only then would it make sense to interpret these associations in terms of higher order cognitive processes. But as you can see from the heat maps here, we found hardly any associations in this early time window. And we also didn't find any relevant associations with other seed electrodes. So it's really this frontal cluster here that drives the effect. And what I found most exciting was that about 20% of our association between P3 latencies and reasoning abilities here could be explained by individual differences in this measure of global theta connectivity. Only 20%, of course, but yeah, I've been preaching that you need to measure those neurocognitive measures across a wide set of different tasks. Here we only used one single cognitive control task, a shifting task, and I would hope to find even a larger amount of explained variance and a bigger mediation effect if we were able to calculate those measures across a larger number of tasks. But nevertheless, I think those results were quite nice, and they finally confirmed at least part of our theoretical assumptions, so that I'm now somewhat positive and hopeful that the neurocognitive model or framework I'm showing here may actually explain why processing speed is related to reasoning abilities. And I think this is a very interesting model because it actually integrates a number of findings from other labs and other research areas. So for example, when we think about the training or enhancement of mental abilities, then it's really not surprising that experimental manipulations such as our nicotine study or short cognitive training studies that aim at a one-time increase in mental speed do not show any positive effects on reasoning abilities, because it's unlikely that they change the underlying brain structure. However, if we do sufficiently intense and long interventions, which allow increases in white matter tract integrity and mental speed to translate into changes in higher order cognitive functions, this may actually lead to substantive gains in reasoning abilities. And there's one study, the Berlin Cogito study, who used a 100-day training, a very intense longitudinal training of processing speed, working memory capacity, and episodic memory. And in their analysis of the data, Löften and colleagues showed that this training affected white matter tract integrity and also showed moderate transfer effects on reasoning ability that remained for up to 2 years, which I think is really interesting and could also be explained by our model. We can also now get back to the question of working memory capacity finally and try to integrate working memory capacity into our model. I've told you that a higher task about theta connectivity has been shown to reflect a more efficient transfer between memory systems. And because theta activity modulates the synchronization of top-down memory transfer between frontal and parietal brain regions, people with a higher theta connectivity should create bindings in working memory more easily than people with lower theta connectivity, allowing them to easily represent multiple subgoals in memory, which also should help them solving very complex tests of reasoning ability. And the model is also able to explain why working memory tasks without simultaneous processing demands, so very simple binding tasks, are as strongly related as complex band tasks, as shown by the likes of Oliver Wilhelm, Klaus Oberauer, and also Adam Szyderski, because it predicts that the arbitrary binding of items in working memory is an important neurocognitive process underlying reasoning ability. And the model can, of course, also explain why both processing speed and working memory capacity explain more than 50% of variance in reasoning abilities, because it assumes that a higher neural processing speed facilitates a more efficient transfer between memory systems and thus affects reasoning ability. And it's also consistent with the broader theories of cognitive abilities, such the parietal frontal integration theory by Young and Heyer, because it emphasizes the role of certain parietal and frontal brain regions related to memory bindings and cognitive control. It's consistent with the watershed model of fluid intelligence proposed by Kiewit and colleagues, because it defines a number of intermediate neural and cognitive endophenotypes contributing to reasoning ability. And finally, we can also talk about the model in the larger framework of process overlap theory by Kovacs and Conway, because our model defines potential domain general processes that may act as bottlenecks in reasoning. So to wrap up, I've shown you that individual differences in processing speed explain up to 80% of variance in individual differences in reasoning, that we can use mathematical models and chronometric analyses of neural processing to identify distinct stages of information processing that are strongly related to individual differences in cognitive abilities, and that I believe that individual differences with individuals with greater reasoning abilities show a greater speed of higher order processing, because they have certain advantages in the structural and functional organization of brain networks that are associated with a transfer between memory systems. And with this, I would like to close thanking the many collaborators on this project for their very valuable input and support. I would also like the funding agencies, the German Research Foundation and the Baden-Württemberg Foundation for funding my research. And finally, I'd like to thank the Psychonomic Society for inviting me, and also you for your attention. And I'm really looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Anna-Lena, for this interesting talk. And so we can start the discussion. Some of you have already posted questions in the Q&A. So in the Zoom taskbar, and typically that will be on the bottom of your screen, you might need to hover with your mouse over the screen to make it appear. It might be somewhere else if you moved it sometime. So look at the bottom, look on your other screen if you can't see it. So there's the Q&A box. It will display in whatever language you have set Zoom to. And we also have the option to connect you via microphone to talk to Anna-Lena directly, but we do ask that you post some brief version of your question in the Q&A, and then when we call on you, you can signal to me via the raise your hand, which is also in that Zoom bar, that you would like to speak to Anna-Lena directly. So Anna-Lena, I hope you see all the clapping in the chat. So,
I do, thank you.
And I think we should start with two questions that were posted that pertain to your participants and your measures, so that we can clear that up before we go into the more content or theoretical discussion. So one is about that you mentioned that participants have different educational backgrounds. With that, do you mean different, like were these students but with different majors, or do you really mean different levels of education?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we are always trying to not only recruit students. We go to a big effort, for example, to recruit participants through flyers or newspaper advertisements, to not just collect student samples, because obviously student samples are somewhat limited in their range of cognitive abilities. So if we only use, for example, psychology students, we would see all with above average IQ values and therefore underestimate our correlations. So we're typically trying to find a broad sample of participants. And so far, we've always succeeded in having a mean IQ value of around 100 and a typical standard deviation of 10 or 14, depending on the test we've been using. But I think it's also important to say that those studies were run in Heidelberg, and Heidelberg is really a city where a lot of more, I would say, more privileged people are living, a lot of academics. So although we tried to collect broader samples from different educational backgrounds, we could still be doing better by running studies in other cities, for example. But yeah, we try to avoid running students, and we explicitly avoid running students from very selective majors such as psychology or medicine, for example.
Okay, and could you also briefly specify, there was a question by Nafise, what measures for reasoning ability? So what characterizes reasoning ability in the core for you?
Yeah, so we've been working with different kinds of intelligence tests. We've most frequently been working with the Berlin Intelligence Structure Test, which I'm afraid isn't really popular outside of Germany, but it's a really nice test. It takes in the short version about 45 minutes and a longer version about 2 hours and 30 minutes, so it can be quite long. But what's really nice about this test is that it combines certain processing components, processing capacity, processing speed, memory, and creativity, with certain domain components, so verbal, numerical, and figural domains, and sort of crosses them. It's really nice for participants to work on this test, and it's also really nice because you have those processes and domains as researchers. But we haven't only been using the Berlin test. We've also been using Raven's advanced progressive matrices, because the Raven's test is the only non-speeded IQ test that really works. And we have to make sure that our findings aren't just because we're using a highly speeded IQ test. I mean, that would explain why we find high correlations. So we have been using the Raven's matrices to control for the speeded effect of test taking, to make sure that our findings couldn't just be due to this method factor of speed. And I think we once used the Hagener Matrizen test as well, which is an open source sort of alternative to the Raven's matrices.
Okay, great, thanks. So next, I'll go to a question by Christoph Klauer. And so Christoph, if you want to connect, we can do that as well. But so the question is about using the drift rate as a measure of processing speed, and as it's not only based on reaction time per se, but also measuring, also measuring error rates. So in the sense that the drift rate is driven by error rates, he suggests that correlations with intelligence may not be very surprising. And he's wondering if he's missing something here.
Yeah, that's actually a good point. And I sort of skimmed over the details of what kind of task we have been using. So the tasks we have been using were mostly elementary cognitive tasks. So things like the Hick task, where people have to make a very simple binary decision. They see like 2 squares on a screen, and there's a cross in one of the squares, and they have to make a very quick decision. Or the Sternberg memory scanning task, where people see a short memory set and then have to decide if a stimulus that's subsequently presented was contained in the memory set or not. We've been using the Posner letter matching task, where people see 2 letters and have to decide if they're identical or not. We're using this task because they're very popular in cognitive abilities research on mental speed, and people hardly do commit any errors in those tasks. So we have mean accuracy rates across all participants ranging from 0.95 to 0.99. So it's unlikely that those estimates of drift rates are strongly driven by accuracies, because there's little variation in accuracies, which is why I don't think our findings can be attributed to the accuracy factor contributing to the diffusion model estimates. But that makes sense to you?
I think, Christoph, you're connected with us. Maybe it's not working. Maybe we can get back to it, but I think that addressed the question very well. So next, I'm not sure if Richard Schifrin wants to connect with us. I'll offer that you get involved. The question is about the role of inhibition and specifying that a little bit more. And so there is a comment. Oh, there we go. So Rich, you can ask your question.
Okay, I'll just read it. Reasoning could be correlated with capacity of short-term memory because it helps to keep more things in mind at the same time. Processing speed could increase capacity by enhanced recycling. Items in short-term memory decay unless they're attended and rehearsed. And faster speed could increase recycling and thereby increase capacity. Is this related to the model you were trying? Because your model had inhibition, but I wasn't at all clear exactly what role that was supposed to play.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. I think it really boils down to what kind of model we assume of working memory. If we assume a certain, I don't know, if we think about a time-based framework, for example, then we can quite easily integrate how processing speed may facilitate working memory, for example, by increasing the number of items that can be recalled per time or refreshed per time, or we can perhaps assume that certain people process secondary tasks more quickly and therefore have more time for refreshing. Whereas if we assume more binding-based models of working memory, then we have to figure out how neural processing speed may facilitate the maintenance of those arbitrary bindings. And I think when we started thinking about inhibition, at that point where we thought about the role of inhibition and selective attention in explaining the relationship, at this point, we weren't really thinking too much about models of working memory. And this is something I guess I really have to admit at that point. We were thinking that there are executive functions that are in some way related to working memory. So let's go and investigate them. And it's really only by trying to address those measurement issues and thinking about what else in working memory could be related to processing speed, where we sort of, getting into the topic and discussing those different models of working memory. And I think this is really an open research question for me at the moment, to figure out which model of working memory works best in integrating measures of processing speed, how we can fit the whole bunch of findings we have in the working memory literature to integrate it to our models of processing speed and reasoning abilities. And as I said, it's really an open question. We're currently trying to use Klaus Oberauer's and Steve Lewandowski's model of working memory capacity, a simple measurement model, to also estimate individual differences in that kind of model and see how that relates to those other parameters. But we're still in the process of finding tasks we can use well to measure individual differences. So it's really an open question for us at the moment.
So I don't know, Richard, if this answers your question.
Oh, it's as good an answer as could be expected. Thanks.
Thank you. All right. And then we'll move on. We have a question speculating about what happens in healthy aging, so the lessening of white matter integrity in healthy aging. Could this be a useful test of the relationships you talked about, in the sense that older adults might be compensating for the slowing with other strategies?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, perhaps that's a question I have to hand over to Beatrice, who's an expert in cognitive aging. But we have looked into at least a little bit into research between age differences, processing speed, and reasoning abilities. And what we found was quite interesting, that when you use those diffusion model parameters, and as I said, it's typically the drift rate that's related to reasoning ability. And even if you have age heterogeneous samples and you could control for age differences, nothing changes about this relationship, which I find always really surprising. Whereas when you take a look at the relationship between age differences and reasoning abilities, you can actually see that it's fully accounted for by individual differences in processing speed. So once you control for processing speed, you no longer find any association between age differences and reasoning abilities. This is a really exciting finding. We tried to look into that using diffusion model parameters, and in two studies, we found that this effect could be accounted for not by the drift rate, but rather by the non-decision time parameter of the diffusion model. So the parameter that describes the speed of encoding and response processes. And because we didn't have any data on white matter tract integrity, we only had EEG data. We tried to link those findings also to EEG variables. And when summarizing or integrating our results, we came to the conclusion that this age-related slowing is most likely to reflect the early onset of a very general cognitive decline process that's most likely to be first detected in processes of response preparation and response execution, which then, once participants become older, may also be more noticeable in other kinds of cognitive processes. But we think it's likely that this early age-related slowing reflects a slowing or a detriment in certain response preparatory processes that are both reflected in the non-decision time parameter of the diffusion model and also in the P3 latency component, because that is also reflecting certain response preparation processes. I don't know about white matter tract integrity. I think it's quite likely that we would see a decrease of white matter tract integrity. I'm not entirely sure if it might be a larger decrease in frontal brain regions, or if it would be comparable decrease across the whole brain, but effects of certain higher order processes would be more noticeable at first. But I'm definitely not an expert in cognitive aging, so yeah, but that's at least my take on the relationship between processing speed and age differences.
Okay, and I think Andrea Halpan, who had this question, you're connected with us at the moment, if you want to add anything.
Oh yeah, just thank you very much. I think it might be interesting. Sometimes individual differences are actually exaggerated in the older population. So I think that's also an interesting take, that in lots of aging research, you find some older adults that behaviorally look like younger adults. And so I think that would be a particularly interesting lens for this whole model. So thank you.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. That's actually a very interesting suggestion. Yeah.
All right, thanks, Andrea. And I'll give speaking permits to Aline Bompas if she wants to add anything. She actually has two questions in the chat, and one I think ties into this one by asking about whether you ever investigated those measures directly in relation to white matter integrity. And then we can also go back to drift rate, because following on what you responded there, Aline posed the question whether the accuracy being near ceiling might cause any problems in estimating the drift diffusion model.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can perhaps briefly say something to the question of white matter tract integrity, and not yet. So I haven't yet collected any data on that, but I very recently got a project, and I hope that I can start data collection on that in summer, and then I will be able to integrate white matter tract integrity, measures of EEG, neural processing speed, connectivity, and behavioral measures in one study. Because I was originally hoping that there might be a large scale data set available somewhere out there, because there are a lot of large scale brain data sets, for example, the Human Connectome project, but I'm not aware of one that integrates measures of white matter tract integrity and also task-related EEG activity. So that's why I will be collecting that data, but I don't have it yet. I hope to have it in, let's say, 1 or 2 years. And regarding the question of the drift rate, this is something we try to address using quite extensive analysis of model fits. So we looked into recovery of our behavioral data using the model estimates we gained through the estimation process. And we evaluated how well we were able to recover our behavior data. And it's definitely true that the accuracy rate was the parameter we were not able to recover perfectly in comparison to the quantiles of the RT distribution, but it was doing a decent job. And we also did some splits among participants' data, saying we had one participant who completed 200 trials, and we did an odd even split of those data to estimate drift rates based on the odd trials and based on the even trials, and then made sure that those two measures were correlated as a measure of both reliability, but also as a sanity check of model estimation to see that we estimated not noise, but meaningful parameters. So all of those diagnostics together seem to be doing fairly well. And in the study I showed you in the very beginning, where we used the more complex and the more simple decision time tasks, we were actually able to find one shared factor of both the very simple task, where we found very little variation in accuracy rates, and the more complex task, where people had lower accuracy rates in general. And even there, we were able to model a joint factor of drift rates. So I am very confident that what we were measuring in those drift rates, even the very simple task, was valid, although the recovery of accuracy rates wasn't perfect because they were so near ceiling. Yeah.
All right, thank you very much.
Of course.
All right. And I think while we're on drift rate, there's 2 questions in the Q&A concerning the meaning of drift rate. So if you can say more about the relationships between drift rate, speed, and attention control. That's a question by Andrew Conway. And then also about the relation of drift rate in the DDM to the traditional construct of selective attention versus of processing speed. So this is posted by Alexander Weigart, and he's asking because the other accumulator models like LBA can dissociate between overall speed of evidence accumulation and selective attention to evidence. And in the DDM, this is not clearly separated.
Mm-hmm. Those are interesting questions. So I think in general, measures of attentional control or selective attention, it could be processes contributing to drift rate. So in general, the diffusion model is just a measurement model because it's a very broad model. Andrew? It's a very broad model that you can apply to a large number of tasks. And depending on the task you're using, those diffusion model parameters are likely to reflect different things. As I said, they're sort of task specific. So one question we've been talking about is whether attentional processes might influence the drift rate. So if a higher drift rate might perhaps indicate that people have better attentional control or fewer attentional lapses while they process a task. And I guess we don't know because the diffusion model doesn't say anything about attentional processes. So the latent processes contributing to drift rates could be things that people mean when they talk about attentional processes. I wonder, I'm not aware of a study that directly related drift rate parameters to valid estimates of attentional control, but that is, again, mostly because I think because it's really hard to measure attentional control. We have one paper forthcoming in JEP General where we used a mathematical model of selective attention. to very specifically model those attentional processes and the selective attention process in the flanker task. And I guess we could just use those data, those estimates from the selective attention model to relate them to drift rates and other tasks. But we haven't done that. So that's something we could simply do. But yeah, actually I haven't looked into that. I agree, I guess, with, that with Alexander, that I think in the LBA, it's easier to distinguish between those two processes depending on as measures of the accumulators, whereas the diffusion model is a very integrative drift rate measure. I think it really depends on the task that you're applying the diffusion model to, and then it would depend on your theoretical conceptions of what contributes to the drift rate. Because if you think about it, there could be a lot of processes that in turn contribute to drift rates. I think for me, it's always really important to make myself aware of the fact that the diffusion model is really agnostic regarding attentional processes. And that there are several steps where you could integrate attention into the model. Also, if you think about the diffusion constant, so the little oscillation intensity across the random walk within each trial, that's typically fixed to a certain value, let's say 1 or 0.1, to make the model identifiable. But in principle, you could also fix any other value of the model to estimate this diffusion constant. And then we could ask ourselves, is perhaps this diffusion constant related to the way attention fluctuates during a trial? But those are really interesting questions, I think.
And I think Andrew and Alexander, if you want to add anything, you can connect with us. Seems like your answers were satisfactory.
Yes, thank you very much.
Yeah. All right, then we can move on to a question by Isa Segura. I don't know, maybe you want to find that slide. So this is asking on the analysis where you control the unit and diversity model of executive functions for the latent variable of processing speed. And it seems that you used a hierarchical model of executive functions. And the question is, why did you not use, whether that's the case, and why did you not use the original 3 correlated factor model?
Yeah, I think I'll just quickly jump back to the slide. That could be useful. Let's see. Here it is. So we started by using the original model because we wanted to make sure that our data were consistent when using the original model. But once we used drift rates instead of this measure between mixture between accuracy rates and response times, you see those very, very high correlations. And mathematically, it's really the model of correlated factors is actually identical to a hierarchical model. So having this model or having a hierarchical model are sort of the same things as long as you have those correlations. And the reason we use the hierarchical model is that we wanted to control, let me just skip 2 slides, this general processing efficiency. And because those 3 latent lower level factors were so highly correlated, it was the easiest way to model this, just to check how, what remained of this general factor after controlling for the general processing efficiency. You also see here grayed out that we didn't see any residual variance in inhibition and updating after controlling for the general factor. So introducing this general factor sort of explained for all variants, at least in there, not entirely in shifting, as I said. So there wasn't really much left. So in our context, it didn't really make much of the difference. And I think if we reframed the original Miyake and Friedman model in a hierarchical model, then we would see larger residual variances here, because the correlations we had here were notably lower. But for us, it was just the easiest way to control for baseline processing efficiency. I hope that makes sense. Otherwise, just please ask away.
No, it's okay. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And then there's maybe it's more a comment than a question, or maybe an idea also following on the age differences we talked about. So Elif Bastan, and I don't think she's here anymore, but she suggested in the Q&A box, because you're concerned with individual differences, whether you have thought about studying it in different clinical conditions like autism or psychosis. And there's a reference here that there's literature on reasoning and autism showing significant relationships between higher level of autistic-like traits and slower yet more accurate reasoning with less engagement and reasoning biases. So I don't know if you have thought about this or maybe have done any research in that direction.
No, I haven't really done anything in clinical populations. That sounds really interesting, but yeah, I haven't looked into that yet. And yeah, I've mostly been using healthy populations. We explicitly screen people to not have psychiatric and neurological disorders because we put them into the EEG, and once you mix up those samples, you can get very conflicting results. So I'm afraid I cannot really say anything about that, but I think it's a really interesting suggestion. Yeah.
It might be a chance to see those individual differences more clearly in those populations. Mm-hmm. So I'll give speaking permission to Richard Schifrin again, who has a follow-up question. So we'll go back to drift rates.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Perfect.
I am very surprised at the very high correlations with drift rate, because there's about an uncountable number of evidence accumulation models by now, and you were using a rather simplified version of the one Ratcliffe has put forward, and it still achieves very high correlations, which makes me think it's measuring something in particular about speed of processing. And that makes me wonder if you did, maybe you already showed this, if you did obtain the same kind of high correlations, if your measure of reasoning ability was Ravens, but not the speed test.
Yeah, that's something we checked in the very beginning when we set out to do that line of research, to make sure it's not due to the speed also in the reasoning test. And it doesn't really change. So when we modeled reasoning ability, I didn't really go into detail here in my talk, but when we model reasoning ability, we typically have a higher order hierarchical factor that loads onto Ravens and then also onto the other reasoning test that is more speeded. So we make sure that our measure is not, so that the speed specific variance is controlled for, and that the correlations are not due to speed. Yeah, we didn't do this in all studies. So I think when we did it in the first two, we stopped doing that just because we saved ourselves some time not applying Ravens in each study, because it always takes about an hour, and you sometimes have participants who keep doing the Ravens for 2.5 hours because they really want to solve all items. So at some point we stopped doing this, but we have a couple of studies showing that our results do not depend on including only speeded reasoning measures.
Okay. Sometime offline, I will talk about this with you separately. Thanks.
Yeah, definitely. I like that.
Okay, it's a good warning about being careful about including Ravens in your study.
Well, you can always use a time constraint on Ravens. It's quite interesting. I think there are a couple of psychometric studies showing that if you introduce like a 30-minute time constraint, it still is quite highly correlated with a pure power measure. But there are also studies, I think, by Roberto Colom and Adam Chudiarsky, who show that once you introduce the time constraint, Ravens are more a measure of working memory capacity than a measure of fluid intelligence. So that's quite interesting. So yeah, it shifts the focus a little.
Interesting. Okay, and so this is our last call for questions, as currently we don't have any open questions. There there don't seem to be more questions, but there's a lot more thank yous for the great talk, interesting and compelling. So thank you again, Anna-Lena. This is really interesting and also a great discussion. Thought about the drift rate quite a bit more deeply, I think, today than before. And so with that, I think we can close this session. The next One World CPS hosted by the Psychonomic Society will be in March 23rd. Karen Schloss will talk about that color means what, understanding people's expectations about the meanings of visual features to facilitate visual communication. And so I'm not sure if someone from the Psychonomic Society has anything else to announce. I think the tickets are already available for the next talk, so you can go and sign up for that. And again, thank you, Anna-Lena, for the great talk and discussion.
Yeah, thank you for having me and also for everyone engaging in the discussion. It was really fun to talk about my research. Thank you.